you know, we are in Lent, and I think it's a good time to visit this school that Pope Benedict approaches explicitly with his encyclical about hope that is suffering. Suffering as a setting for learning hope. Really, he speaks together about action and suffering, but action is number 35 and suffering is 36 to 40, so he gives more space to that. You know that our world really is kind of scandalized by suffering, cannot accept it, cannot face it. And we can see that, for example, in that law of euthanasia. Why? To avoid suffering, to kind of hide it. In the funerals, that always death is a moment of grieving, we make it all easy, all gentle, and a person cannot know that he's going to die because that is going to cause distress, and distress is something that we cannot afford, and then suffering is something that makes the life of one person unworthy or is losing dignity. Well, that's the approach of our world. So how can we bring to this world and to our own lives that hope also in moments that are certainly challenging, that are those moments of suffering that you know that are part of our life. But certainly God didn't abandon us in suffering, but he came. He was made man himself to be in all our human conditions, even suffering and death, except for sin. I put a little note at the beginning about how to understand suffering, and I think that helps. When we approach the human person, the church distinguishes 3 levels. For example, about sexuality, that is also clear. In suffering happens as well. In many dimensions, we are that way. So one level is the physical suffering, what we would call pain. Animals have pain, but they don't suffer. Why? Because they don't have the subjective experience of it. They don't have that consciousness of suffering that really challenges their own identity and the meaning of their lives. Because no, they are just animals, so they can suffer pain, but suffering is something specifically human. Second, the psychological level. So there is a psychological suffering. Really, we now speak explicitly about suffering. Maybe the other can be just called pain. And spiritual. We can just have pain in our soul, not even psychologically. Although, as we are a unity of body and soul, all that are very deeply intertwined, so very tight, so it's always all together. Okay, so let's begin visiting what the Pope tells us. And I just took some few places in his encyclical about suffering, so that you can read about it and meditate about it and discuss as couples about it. When you make suffer the other. Wow. And maybe many times without an intention, but we are so different that except if we have a lot of maturity, and that comes with age. So when you are young, you can have that. It's a little tool that you pay for that tool, not all. Sorry. Okay. So we are so different that there is always fun. If we have sense of humor, maturity, and understanding perspective, we are very different, so we operate in different ways. Then that can make it easy. But sometimes we are in a moment where we are not so in good mood, and we can take the things very personally and get hurt where there is none. And that means suffering. And when there is a failure of someone to the other, of trust, of confidence, of attention, or, well, that can really hurt, as you know. So the main thing about suffering in the perspective of the Pope is God has been with us in suffering. Part of our human experience of suffering is that when someone is with us, that brings consolation. And certainly when someone shares our suffering, that is showing love. And when love enters in a human experience, everything is changed. Because love is showing my dignity, my value. This is why I'm worthy of love, even in this situation. No? And then love transforms suffering, gives its its meaning, and suffering, for example, instead of being a moment of loneliness and desperation, is a moment of communion, because we suffer together. And that can bring us even closer, no? Because in moments that are hard for both or one of them, the other is there for me, with me. I can stand for the other person is standing by me. Okay. Well, this gains a whole new dimension when the one who is with us in suffering, the one who shows us love in suffering, and the one who suffered for us and sacrificed for us. Because one thing is that I have suffering and the other comes and consoles me and shares my suffering. The other thing, and God has gone there, is when I suffer for you to avoid, to spare you your suffering. And that is what Jesus did in the cross, precisely that. No? So that is even more love that God has shown us. And then is God's love entering in our life and giving us a new meaning. Without God, there is no hope. The Pope has said that a couple times in the encyclical, several times. No? And in suffering, this is even clearer. Okay, so let's visit these paragraphs and make a little remark. The first one, we can try to limit suffering, to fight against it, but we cannot eliminate it. The only one that can eliminate it is God. And one of the craziness of our science and technology and progress is that we are going to cancel suffering. No. There are things that have hurt or have affect humanity in the deepest way. Disease or infirmity, suffering and death. And those are consequences of sin. And they are there deep in our hearts because of sin. And when we were redeemed by Christ, and God made again all creation, he didn't want to cancel that. Because suffering is a school to trust in the others and in God, to love and to receive love. I remember an old priest in my parish, he was getting older and he got a strong flu, no? So he said, well, so far I have been taking care of others, now it's time for me to be cared by others. That's a lot of wisdom and certainly a big challenge in life. You're still caring for others, and now others have to care for you. And we'll be there if we live in that. So, and it's beautiful how parents who have taken care of your children, and one day maybe they can repay just a little, very little, taking care of you. And that will be for them very good. Because they understand that they can repay a little, and it's a recognition of how much you have given them. Okay. So, about the first paragraph, that. Number 38. And here, the Pope goes to something really, as I told you, it's something specifically human, in which the human dignity is unveiled or revealed in a very special way. The true measure of humanity is essentially determined in relationship to suffering and to the sufferer. This holds true both for the individual and for the society. First, the society. A society unable to accept its suffering members and incapable of helping to share their suffering and to bear it inwardly through compassion is a cruel and inhuman society. Abortion. Euthanasia. You see? Why a child with deformities, infirmities, or Down syndrome or whatever, how many Down syndrome kids we see around? Where are they? In those cemeteries in Canada, etc., around the parishes and all that, that is so a big scandal for us. And we call them in the womb. Okay. So, really, cruel and inhuman society. Yet, and we are moving forward, society cannot accept its suffering members and support them in their trials unless individuals are capable of doing so themselves. And this is what family do. I'm sure you can share with me a lot of experiences in this sense, but in Spain, for example, in the crisis of the 2008, 9, 10, the church in Spain that is kind of hated by many, gained a lot of respect in society because at the end was the church taking care of and family. Family as an institution in Spain showed to be very strong because the grandparents, one or two kids with older families were just depending on the retirement of the grandparents. And with that, the family would move forward and with some help of the church. No? So in these moments, society is not an abstract, society is each of us. So when every individual can do that, then society can do that. Society cannot do that. Because this is the personal care, when the person is engaged in love for the one who's suffering. That is not done by institutions. And for example, you know the difference between a hospital run by a staff or a hospital run by nuns. It's very different. Yeah? And if not, ask your parents, because maybe today this is kind of no more in our experience. Okay, and then we'll move forward. The individual cannot accept another's suffering. Individuals are capable of doing so themselves, caring for others. Moreover, the individual cannot accept another's suffering unless he personally is able to find meaning in suffering, a path of purification and growth in maturity, a journey of hope. Something for you to think about. How much should you let your kids suffer? Sometimes we have these helicopter parents whose children are immature until they turn 45. And sometimes your children do not want to learn by your word and what you have told them, and they have to experience it themselves. And that is going to be painful for them, and especially for you. Are you ready to accept that? Because suffering is a path of purification, growth in maturity, a journey of hope. Well, furthermore, next paragraph. Furthermore, the capacity to accept suffering for the sake of goodness, truth, and justice. So we go even beyond. One thing is the suffering that we have and how society, through individuals and individuals themselves, offer care and company and love and meaning to those who suffer. But there is another situation of suffering when I accept it for the sake of truth, goodness, and justice. That is an essential criterion of humanity. And I have a question for you. I don't know how much challenging, but if you turn the page, reflection. Second point, do you know someone who has risked his status or career to stand for the truth, goodness, and justice? This is increasingly part of our lives. The cancel culture, gender and trans pronouns, for example, COVID mandates, all those things. So maybe yourselves are there. So, well, that's an essential criterion of humanity. Because my own well-being and safety are ultimately more important than truth and justice. Then the power of the stronger prevails, if I do that. Truth and justice must stand above my comfort and physical well-being, or else my life itself becomes a lie. Okay, then let me add one thing. It's not about your life, it's the life of your family. So, because of your risk, your children are going to suffer. And maybe they cannot go to that school you want, but have to go to a public school. And that is terrible for them. It's a tragedy. And I know. Well, it's not easy. And I'm sorry, this is increasingly part of our lives. You know better. Eh? Okay. Another step. How to accompany others in suffering. And to suffer with the other and for the others. To suffer for the sake of truth and justice. to suffer out of love. And in order to become a person who truly loves, these are fundamental elements of humanity. And to abandon them would destroy man himself, and certainly society. So here the Pope is kind of summarizing what he just presented, and then introduce God in the equation. Because now is when the equation really has a solution and makes sense, no? So that statement is clear. To abandon that would destroy human himself. Now, yet again, once again, the question arises: are we capable of this? Of suffering with the others, of loving others in suffering, of taking suffering on our own for the sake of justice and good? Well, we have seen that in Christianity, in the gospel, in Christ, in faith, and especially we have seen that in the saints. If you want to go to the encyclical, I think is precisely this number, 39. The Pope brings a text of I think it's a Vietnamese martyr, St. Paul. I don't remember the Vietnamese name is St. Paul. We celebrated, I think, in February, his feast, no, his martyrdom and companions. And he writes from the jail saying, this is hell, really hell. And the Pope makes a remark how it's not only that is hell because of the guards and all that are torturing them, it's also because other prisoners also are torturers for others. So, and he says, blasphemies, offenses, tortures, all that. However, here, the light of faith comes, and this is the expression the saint uses, I throw the anchor, as St. Paul says, into heaven, and I am firmly anchored there. No? And this is the theme of the year, anchored in hope, anchored in Christ. And in that situation of suffering, there is no other way to act. Yeah, the Pope also reminds how Jesus himself descended into hell. Well, the place of the dead, we say that in the Creed, but certainly to that suffering, abandonment, etc. Well, we turn the page and the last paragraph. Certainly in our many different sufferings and trials, we always need the lesser and the greater hopes too. Not only our, okay, it's gonna be okay, this is gonna pass, so let's move forward. No, we need sometimes, especially when the things get really difficult, we need that great hope that only can come from God. No. In truly great trials where I must make a definitive decision to place the truth before my own welfare, career, and possessions, let me say it again, even that of my family, I need the certitude of that true great hope of which we have spoken here. For this too, we need witnesses, martyrs, who have given themselves totally so as to show us the way, day after day. The saints, and we are called to holiness, as you know, so saints are not extraordinary people that are now in the church at mass, no? We are supposed to be those saints. The saints were able to make the great journey of human existence in the way that Christ had done before them, because they were brimming with great hope. And at the end, he's taking the cross with Christ. So it's not about taking the cross, it's about being with Christ. If it is with Christ in Mount Tabor, it's going to be a lot of fun. If it is with Christ in Calvary, it's going to be even more fun. Okay, so for your reflection, first question, how can we bring consolation to people suffering? And not only consolation, how can we bring hope? It's not the same thing. And meaning, a sense of their worthiness, of their value, of their dignity, all those things that our world just tries to deny and hide. And also, I make a point about the culture of funerals. It's not a setting to practice hope. Yeah? Even we have to laugh and make jokes, and the eulogy has to be funny, and I'm sorry, this is my mother who's there. I don't want jokes. Well, that's our Spanish culture. Maybe too dramatic. No, but certainly you get it. Family project, 2 suggestions. Review with your children how Lent is going and rekindle that spirit of sacrifice and giving up things, no? We start so strongly at the beginning of Lent, and then 4 Sundays later, well, 3 weeks later, we have lost gas and momentum. Okay, so let's reignite that fire. Or step up to the next level if you're ready for that. Okay? So we can, there is always another step, a next step that we can take. Depends on where your family is, what's the next step. Then, second suggestion, discuss as a family how to set a tone of offering up the small inconveniences of daily life. For me as a child was a great school. This time of Advent and Lent especially, and how we lived the Holy Week at home, for me was a great school to learn to offer things up, to accept little sufferings, little thorns that, you know, kids always just picking on the others. Well, to learn how to offer that up. And even to embrace personal sacrifice, to join them to Jesus' suffering in the cross. I'm sorry, how because of way many you have no option but to renounce many things you have very well. I don't know. It seemed clear that I was kind of, maybe that's a leftover from the previous text that I was arguing over, so forget it. Okay, next, Galilee Retreat, April the 24th, and hopefully you have a time not of suffering together, but of hope together.
You said retreat?
Yeah, that's the date.
This,
oh, okay.
exactly.
I was like,
This Galilee thing.
I missed the last one.
So I always put the